But we want to welcome you all out today. And today's talk is a little bit, it's a little less formal, I want to say. It's about pasture poultry. But again, with small flocks and backyard flocks, it's kind of a different area, and we'll go on that. But if you have any questions or comments or concerns as we go along, feel free to put them in the chat box. And with that, I guess we'll get talking today about the advantages and disadvantages of raising pasture poultry. Now, again, we always have to have our great disclaimer as we go along. Let's see if it'll work. Yep, there we go. The great disclaimer, and that is the advice in this presentation does not represent medical, veterinarian, or legal advice. I put the legal on there to make my lawyer friends happy. And then if we use any websites or name brands or anything like that, we're not endorsing that product. It's just an example of something that will work and something that you can use. And again, today we're going to talk about pasture poultry, but small flocks, by their very nature, backyard flocks typically always have access to pasture. We see that almost everybody allows them to have some time free in the yard. They're great. They clean up the bugs. They do some things around there. So again, we're always kind of with the backyard people, with the backyard flocks, small flocks, we're looking at a little bit different than people that say are commercial. You know, when you go to commercial, you're on a different size, that they're trying to sell a lot of animals and things along those lines. So it's a different area. But again, today, you know, most of the pasture is limited to the size of your backyard, or if you're really unlucky, to your neighbors as well. So what are the benefits of pasture poultry? And this is something we hear a lot about. And so let's talk, just, you know, go through them real quick. First off, birds leap forage and bugs and reduce cost of feed. I hear this all the time, but does it really reduce the cost of feed? What does it do? Another thing we hear a lot about is meat and eggs will be healthier. Again, I put questions on all these because we're going to go over all of them. You know, the well-being of the animals is improved. You know, they're healthier. Are the animals healthier? Are they less stressed? Is there more stress, or what's going on? And the other thing I always hear is environmental. And everybody always says there's less pollution. So we'll kind of look at each of these individually as we go through today. And again, if you have any questions as we go along, put them in, and Megan can interrupt me and let me know. So first off, I have heard many times reports, people saying, oh, you can reduce your feed cost 30 to 33% just by putting chickens out on pasture. Well, my first concern when I hear that, and I always say this back to them, is show me the research. Now, I'm all about putting birds out on pasture. I know they eat bugs. I know they eat some of this stuff down, but what is it really doing for the overall benefit or the overall food reduction? Now, there's been some really cool research done over in Europe, and there's a couple doctoral dissertations that look at this subject specifically. And what they found was typically it's about 5%, but you can get up pushing 20% of the feed from pasture if you plant that pasture with a crop for that bird to consume. So again, we're not talking about, you know, your lawn. We're not talking about a pasture where you keep your cows. We're talking about a crop that has actually been planted for the birds to eat. One of the ones that they found was on the lower end, but was very beneficial, and we all typically have it, and that was the white clover. So if you have white clover, that is actually something the birds can consume, and it's higher in protein, and they can actually digest some of that. The problem with grass itself is it's not digestible. Now, if you look at this one here is just somebody sent me this photo, and you look at the grass here. Oh, it's got sound. I didn't know that. But if you look at the grass, look how much pasture they got, all that lush green pasture, but those birds are hungry. And there's a reason for that. Birds can't digest cellulose and hemicellulose. So while they can consume the grass, it really doesn't do them much benefit. There are some small benefits they get from it, such as they can get higher levels of beta carotene, vitamin A. So there are some small benefits there. But again, as you look at that, you can see how hungry those birds are. Now, when I first saw this, one thing that came to my mind was they need more feeder space, because those birds need more space to eat. That's definitely not enough feeder space there. But it's kind of an indicator when you look at how green and lush that pasture is, still not feeding those birds. So when I was working for USDA ARS, we actually did a study where we took some of these little hoop houses and we put them out on a cow pasture, and we moved them across the pasture. There's actually 12 huts. You can't see there's one more right here you can't see, but anyway, there's 12 of them. If you look, some have a floor in the bottom, so the birds can't access the pastures, and others are open so that the birds, as you see here, can actually reach down and eat the grass and benefit from those forages if they can. And it was interesting. Now, we did this with broilers, and I want to make a big distinction because layers and broilers are very different in the amount of foraging they'll do. But with broilers, we really didn't see any reduction in feed whatsoever. In fact, we couldn't find any difference. It was pretty much a zero benefit as far as feed consumption went. We also found no difference in weight gain and a lot of other things as well. But the thing that's important to know is we did open them up. We did see that they were consuming the grass. We knew they were getting some bugs because we would find bugs in the waters, which I thought was interesting. I found worms in waters quite often. I'm like, how the heck did that worm get all the way up there to that water? So the chickens were picking them up, not always consuming them, and sometimes just dropping them in the water. It's kind of an interesting thing to do. So the other thing is, while the birds can consume plants and insects, the total amount typically does not influence the overall consumption of the meat birds, unless the pasture is specifically planted for them. Now, legumes are the best thing that you can plant out there for meat birds. They're going to, well, for all layers too. They're going to typically utilize those better. Grasses become more mature, they become less digestible. We saw that in the early spring, they were able to digest or benefit. Well, not really benefit. They consumed more grass in the early spring than they did later in the summer when it got dry and not as palatable. And again, that would also make sense because as grasses become larger and older, they become less nutritious. So one thing I tell people, if you are going to use a pasture poultry, keep it mowed down, and that allows that grass to be more digestible, or at least they'll be able to get the vitamins out of it easier. And pasture's not always present. And that's another thing to remember during the winter. During the summer, in the heat of the summer, they don't always have pasture. So think about this as you go through it. Now, layers will forage much better than meat birds. Let's face it, meat birds, all they do is they grow fast. And so they're not as active. And that's one of the things that allows them to grow quicker. If they're not spending their energy running around, well, they're going to spend it on growing. So you can get foraging better from layers. And another thing you can do them is restrict feed. If you restrict feed on birds, like in that video, those birds were feed restricted. Again, that will kind of encourage them to go out and to consume more of the pasture, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to benefit all that much for it. Now, as I said, here's a crop of a layer. This was one of the layer hens we had on another trial that we did. As you can see, she was consuming some of the grasses. You can see there's grass, there's forages and things in here as well. May or may not have been bugs. I didn't really find any. But if they were younger, larval stage, they'd blend right in with some of this feed and some of the other stuff. So again, we do see that they do eat the bugs. We know that they do. If you've ever had chickens around your house, you typically don't have crickets. I have friends in Arkansas. They have a ranch where they keep their horses. They actually keep a flock of birds. And the whole reason they have those birds there is to keep the bugs down. They found that by putting those birds there, they would eat the ticks and crickets and things down. They don't have near as much problem with their animals. So again, there are ways. We know that it works. How much it affects their diet is going to depend on a lot of different things. They also eat small reptiles and amphibians. I meant to find them. I got a picture of a chicken eating a frog. And I was at a farm one day and I was running for my camera because this chicken had got a hold of a snake. It was probably about 18 inches long. There's about 8 inches hanging out the mouth, and they were all trying to grab it, and it was trying to swallow it. It was kind of an interesting thing to watch, but before I could get my camera, she got it swallowed down into her crop. So again, they will eat a lot of different things that are out there. And again, the stage of the insect's development can influence how digestible they are. For example, if you get a larvae, it doesn't have all that exoskeleton, so they're able to digest more of it. If it's got an exoskeleton, that exoskeleton is not going to be digestible, so it's going to pass right through them. And to put it in perspective, if it has an exoskeleton, hell, you figure most of those animals are 50. Well, we'll go 50% to make it easy. 50% water. Well, then you got 25% of the skeleton. So you start going down. There's really not a lot there by the time you figure all the undigestible parts out that are actually digestible to the bird. However, it does all add up and it all helps. And again, I mentioned what's going on in the pasture area is very important. This is the pasture area for my daughter's birds. As you can see, there's not much they can do out there at this time of year. So again, this is actually just the other day, we've had some torrential rains. If any of you are on the shore, you know what I'm talking about. There's flooding everywhere. So again, if you have something like this, it's actually not beneficial to put your birds out there. In fact, it can actually in some ways be harmful. By that, I mean their feet are always going to be wet, but two, you're going to find a lot of worms, ground worms. And we know that they actually are a source of infection for a lot of internal parasites. So consuming a whole lot of them at one time can actually lead to intestinal or to internal parasitic load increase. So when you have something like this, just keep them locked up. There's no reason to be out there. They're not going to benefit from it. And again, we're going to have to keep an eye on the birds after this, because you want to make sure their foot health stays good, as they're going to be wet quite often in a situation like this. So are the meat and eggs from pasture healthier for you? So I kind of changed it to that way. And I looked up the definition of healthy, and I like this. It's possessing good health, or conducive to good health, helpful, healthier, for example. Healthier foods are those that are the most nutritionally dense. They contain the highest amount of fats, vitamins and minerals, with the least amount of unhealthy fats and calories. So again, when we look at healthier, this is kind of a good definition to go with it. But what I always like to add too is, what about food safety? If we're talking about healthy, that's something we've always got to keep in our minds is, okay, if I've got this product, is it safe to consume? Is it something that is beneficial and not going to cause harm to those that consume it? So while there are some research suggests that there is an increase in vitamin A and reduction of fat in the meats. So we know that there are some benefits there. That would be beneficial. Vitamin A is great. However, this all went away if you remove the skin. And if you think about it, that really does make sense, because in poultry, the majority of the fat is in the skin. So if you're doing a skinless breast, you're removing all the fat, which, that might be beneficial, but at the same time, you're also not going to be able to get the fat soluble vitamins. So, you need fat to have the fat soluble vitamins. So if you're removing it, you will be reducing those as well. So by the time you take that off, then you kind of negate the benefit that you did gain. Other research found no difference in the levels of vitamins, fat, cholesterol, or even the fatty acid profile, looking at it across the board. So again, what they eat is very important, but how you actually consume the animal is almost as important. Other claims that are often made are, some claim that pasture poultry has a healthier color. Again, color is really derived from pigmentation. You can actually raise birds that are very bland and colored if you don't give them anything that has xanthophylls. Corn now has xanthophylls in it, and that'll make that yellow coloring. Or you can actually get breeds of birds that don't get yellow fat. Their fat is white. So there are other things to look at as you go through this. So color can be an indicator of it better, or it could just be a color of the breed. So there's a lot of different things to take into consideration about this. Taste. This is one of my favorite ones. And when I was in Arkansas, we did a lot with this. Many claim that free-range poultry tastes better. So in a blind taste test where consumers can't, everything's done by a trained chef, done identically, and consumers can't tell the difference between the different whether it was raised on pasture or not. And that's really interesting. And when you do these type of trials, you actually change the color so they can't see any color difference. They can't do anything. It's all in pure and simply taste. Most consumers couldn't tell a difference. However, trained chefs could detect a difference. So we can assume that there is a slight difference in taste. But I always wanted to follow up and look at is that we know that taste changes with the age of the bird, and typically pasture poultry takes longer to produce. Is that difference there because of the increase in age, or is it because of something from the pasture? I think it'd be really fun to try and look at that further and elucidate what is going on there. From the food safety point of view, on-farm processors often don't have the same food safety protocols that we're going to see in a lot of the plants. For example, some antimicrobials like parasitic acid, which is quite popular in industry. It's essential acid, one of those parasitic acids. They kill bacteria, and we use them. They're a natural substance. We use them all the time, or the plants do. Are we using those when we process our birds? Now, the FSIS's reports show that smaller facilities typically have higher pathogen concentrations than the larger ones. Again, you've got less people going on, so you want to make sure that you keep things clean. And the one that I thought was really interesting is they did a study at Penn State where they found that chicken from farmers markets were higher in Campylobacter and Salmonella than chicken from the store. Now that can be conceived as bad. I'm kind of, this is going to sound funny. I've always heard of these things that I've always, read about them, but my opinion is this: if you cook all your chicken and follow good food safety protocols, it really shouldn't be a problem. But again, you need to make sure that you cook your product well, or at least to the proper temperature, and that you make sure that you don't cross-contaminate in your chicken. That said, chickens that consume a lot of grass tend to have more impacted crops. than chickens that don't, just because the grass is not digestible and it wads up in a ball in their crop and can lead to more problems. And again, that's another reason to keep it short, because it has to be a long piece to ball up. So shorter pieces are going to pass through easier. So the reality of meat, the color of the skin can be improved, and can be an increased amount of vitamin A and fat in the fat of the skin. Again, it all depends on the pasture. Is it flooded like right now? Or is it something that's going to be dried out? That's really where it comes down to. When we look at the meat itself, just the meat, we're really not seeing any benefit there. And food safety can also kind of be an issue if we're not very careful with these things. So eggs, let's talk a little bit about eggs. If we look at eggs, some reports have shown that eggs are, pasture eggs are lowering fat and cholesterol. And I laugh because the report I read was looking at the egg as a, it did the whole egg rather than they did it as a percentage of the egg, not as a percentage of the content. And since the eggs were smaller, it's true that the pasture eggs were lower in cholesterol and fat because the egg itself was smaller. If you go and look it out on if you equal the size, it tends to disappear. However, they can have more vitamin A, vitamin E, and beta carotene if they're on good pasture. Additionally, if you have the right kinds of clovers and grasses, you can actually have a slight increase in the omega-3 fatty acids. So can be some benefits, but again, it's very pasture dependent. And if you really want higher omega-3, it's easier to do that using linseed meal in your diet, and you can actually purchase those at most stores. So there are ways to do that without actually worrying about the pasture doing it, but by doing it so you know that you're getting the results you want. Taste. Many claim pasture poultry eggs taste better. This is one of those, I've never been able to prove one way or the other on this one. In blind taste, again, we did blind taste tests, chefs preparing them, put them in a room where they can't see the color of light, and people that will tell me all day long that they taste better on pasture can't tell me which is the pasture egg. That said, we see similar type things like in wine. It's funny. If you take wine and you put it in a bottle, make it look real fancy, or you take the same wine and put it in a box and sell it for half the price, people always tell you the bottle and the fancy tastes better. So again, people are going to perceive it's there. Let them have it. Just don't tell them it's there. That's what I always say. Let them do that on their own. However, the reality is all the possible benefits, like I said, are very dependent upon the pasture. So in winter, when there's no pasture, or in the middle of summer, when everything's dried up, for example, you see down here, this photo, this is an egg production. They're outside. That pasture's dried up and non-existent. It's August in the south. There's nothing there. So there's really no benefit whatsoever in this type of year. However, in the spring, that might have been a different story. And remember, diet plays a bigger part in determining the egg's content and quality. So again, you really want to worry about that diet more than you do anything else, what they're eating for their diet, and then let them supplement with the others. And I see there's a couple of questions. The first one is, because like I said, I don't really want to go in order today. In terms of food scraps, what is off limits? That's a good question. I often don't feed onions because there's always a chance of getting onion flavor in the eggs. So I don't do that one. But as far as I don't give moldy food to chickens, period, because mold can actually be very harmful and cause them health issues. If it's something that you think, like the scraps, if you're putting together like a cabbage and the outside leaves you're not going to eat, heck yeah, they love those things. If you cut the core out of your cabbage, feed it to them, they love them. So again, most things are safe. If you're going to consume it, it's most safe for them if you're just giving them the scraps off the edges. That's just kind of a rail to go. But the thing I'd say on scraps is this: never give them more than about 10% of their diet from scraps or treats. You don't want to go over that. The next question: do chickens feel full? Will they eat and eat if it's always accessible, or will they stop when they feel full? For example, my chickens have full continual access to feed, but devour dried mealworms until they're gone. And that goes back to, it's like our kids. They can have access to a refrigerator full of beneficial food, but throw a Twinkie in there, they're going to fight for it. And that's kind of what those, the mealworms, while they're actually healthier, it's something new. It's a treat. It's a novelty. So yes, chickens do feel full, and typically they're going to eat to meet their needs. You always have some individuals that'll eat too much though, so you want to watch out for those. Now, if you're talking about a broiler, like a commercial type broiler, they actually have a different way of feeling full than most birds, and they're going to consume a lot of food. but that's also, they're going to utilize that food very efficiently to create meat. So again, there's a little bit of difference between the two. And I've really never had with pasture poultry. I always give them access to full feed, but I've never really had a problem with obesity. But if I go out there tonight, let's say to my daughter's birds and take out some corn or something like that, even though they've had food all day, you throw it out there, they're going to fight each other for it. So it's kind of a treat and they like it. So again, limit the amount you give them. And typically I like to give them to them at night this time of year because the nights are cold, and that'll give them that extra energy to get through the night as that digests in their system. All right, back on to where we were at. What about well-being or welfare of the birds? And this is where it really gets kind of fun. So in general, oh wait, man, I'm looking at the wrong screen. I got two screens up here. Dang it. Okay, what is well-being? What does it mean? And this is where it gets really difficult because it means different things to different people. So we need to come up with a statement. And I like this one that came from the National Chicken Council, which states, generally, it means providing animals with their physical and mental needs throughout their life. The physical needs are relatively easily discussed, described, and studied. However, mental or behavioral needs are more debated and often anthropomorphized. Got through that word. Anthropomorphize means to attribute humans, form, or other characteristics, feelings, thoughts to anything other than a human being. And again, I often say this is Disneyfication. Look at Bambi. Look at all these different things. We attributed those feelings and thoughts to animals. So that's anthropomorphism. And yes, I said it right 3 times, so my wife owes me a cookie. All right, so what else does it mean? In general, it means that we raise birds for food or eggs. They should be raised with a cared for in such a way that prevents or minimizes fear, pain, stress, or suffering. Again, that's just common sense. We don't want anything to be fearful, in pain, or stressed out. I mean, that's just common sense. And it's good being a good person. Guidelines for welfare should balance scientific knowledge and professional judgment with consideration for ethical and social values. And that's where it suddenly gets a little harder. What are the social values? And those vary by place and by need and by what's going on. But again, we need to use scientific knowledge, and we need to use some of the local, the empiric knowledge. It is the welfare of the birds themselves that is foremost, not how humans might perceive or practice such things or the environment. So again, it's how the birds perceive it. They don't see the world the same as we do. And I often use the thing of cannibalism. If you put a chicken out there, gets a big scratch on it, they all eat them until they're gone. Well, we don't do that. And they think that's okay. We don't. So we have this different view of the world. And we have to realize that as we work with animals, that we don't always see the world the same way. But we need to use it, again, whatever we can do to make it best for them. Poultry should be treated with respect throughout their lives and provided a humane death when processed for food or when they're euthanized for any other reason. And that is so true. We need to make sure that birds are taken care of. And if we do have to euthanize one, we do it in a manner that minimizes suffering. So what does it mean? Well, in general, again, it means that food and water are readily available for our birds. Are we all doing that? Heck yeah. I mean, that's one of the things we do real easy. We've always heard about the freedoms, the 5 freedoms. Well, do they have the freedom to move, to stand, to turn around, to stretch, to sit, to lie down? Do they have the freedom to do those different things? Again, I don't know of any backyard flocks that don't allow all that. So again, we're doing good there. This is one we see a little more problem with. Birds need to be raised so that they can see each other. Visual contact with other members of the species. And this is really important because chickens are a flocking bird. And so they're going to want to be around other birds. And if you isolate them alone, they can really get stressed out. And the only time I say you do something like that is if they have a contagious disease and you need to move them away from your flock quickly into a different location. Other than that, if they're just injured and you're going to separate them, we'll separate them in a pen where they can see each other and still feel like they're part of that flock. Otherwise, it causes a lot of stress on them. Housing should protect birds from the weather and predators, and it should be made in a way that it doesn't harm or distress the birds. So think about that for a minute. We want to provide an area that's safe for them to go to. We all want that. And again, weather and predators, predators particularly can get challenging at times. And we want the prevention of disease, injury, and vice. If an animals are diseased or injured, or there's an outbreak of feather pecking or cannibalism, we must treat or manage as quickly as possible. And again, these are all common sense things. And I wanted to throw them out there because sometimes we don't think about how simple a lot of this really is. We make it harder than it needs to be. But again, we want to make sure that what we're doing is what's right and what's best for the birds. So I kind of put together some pros and cons of mine here. And I look at it and I say, one of the best things about pasture for their behavior is they get access to grass and bugs. They love to chase them around. Let them loose out there and let them chase around, watch them chase those bugs. I think it's great. They seem to be having fun. Sunshine. Man, who here doesn't want to be out in the sunshine? Flip side of that is it could be a rainy day, so it doesn't good. Breezes and fresh air, they get those. Environmental stimulation, again, part of that is the bugs, the grass, and all those other interactions. However, environmental stimulation could also be that hawk flying over that sends them running like crazy. And then there's consumer perception. One of the things about raising pasture on poultry on pasture is people perceive it as better. If people perceive it as better, then that's a benefit for having it done. But for me, most importantly is the natural behavior. You're going to see a lot more natural behavior out of the birds. Now, some of the cons. They do have access to poisonous plants, or for that matter, any other poisons that are in the environment. If you've got an old junkyard, they're going to go digging through there. They can get access to oil, anything like that. You want to make sure that the area they have is clean and free of chemical hazards. Again, they need to be protected from bad weather. So your housing needs to also not only protect them from predators, but it needs to be in such a way that's going to keep them dry and the wind from blowing on them. Again, you lose temperature control, and that's one of the things that's really hard. I've had some very bad experiences with some of these things outside with no temperature control, trying to do projects in the summer and the winter. So again, take that into consideration. What are you going to do when it's hot? What are you going to do when it's cold? Biosecurity can be a real problem. I mean, how do we keep disease out of our flock if our flock is run outside and interacting with other animals? So again, need to think that through. And then finally, predation. And it's going to happen. That's all there is to it. But there's also stress from visible predators. And I'll show you a picture here in a minute and talk about that. So again, here's just a quick picture of some housing. This is more of a commercial style. They raise meat birds in these and they move them across the pasture. Granted, to me, the pasture needs mowed down. It's a little tall. But they do very beneficial. And these are great houses. You see how high they are. It lets that heat get up and get away from those birds. When you look at these houses, this is another one that we used in all those trials. I didn't like them at all, especially the summertime. With the lid that short and that close to the ground, it trapped a lot of heat in there, and it really caused us problems. In fact, we had to stop a study partway through because the birds were getting heat stress, and we didn't want them to have to deal with that. So again, you want to make sure that whatever you do, you're not causing stress for your birds. Another type of housing, this is where they've took an old farm, and these are old farm from the 40s and reconverted it, and they put the potholes in, and the birds come out during the daytime. And you can see each of these now, each is on the inside, each of those is a pin. And I thought it was really interesting. See how narrow those pins are? Well, they're a couple 100 feet long. We never had problems with predation on this farm. Or, well, take that back. On this part of the farm, apparently with them being that narrow, the hawks wouldn't fly into them. And I thought that was really interesting because on other parts of this farm, we had problems with hawks trying to get birds, but we never had a problem here. And we had two pair of nesting red tails within a quarter mile of this farm. Another thing you want to consider in your housing, now this is a commercial farm, beautiful farm, by the way, but look at what they do. And this is something you need to realize. Birds don't like open pasture. They like cover. They like to feel safe. They like structure. So you can put structure out there for birds to get into. Now, if you're in a yard like my daughter's has, you've got trees around there. They spend a lot of time close to that tree line. They don't spend much time at all out in the open because they want to feel safe. They want something to cover. In the wild habitat in Asia, they live in the bamboo thickets and places like that, or in the brush where they're protected. So again, they don't like open. So if you have open pasture areas, one thing you can do is make you some type of a shade structure to encourage them to utilize the whole pasture. Predators will be a problem. You got your night predators. You got your owls over here for the night. These guys here will come in the night too. Possums, foxes are morning and evening, and then during the day you've got your hawks. So again, you've got predators at all time, and I didn't even put raccoons up there. So you've got those as well. Now, like I said, here's a picture on that farm. Here's the birds. You can't see any of the birds, but there's a hawk. He was sitting right there, and I couldn't get my camera up fast enough to get him while he was still sitting. Reason you can't see those birds, they are all stressed out. They are sitting hunkered down, just trying to hide from that hawk as best they can. It took them a good 20 minutes before they got up and started acting normally again. So just the presence of those hawks coming around or those predators can actually stress those animals. So it's important to keep that in mind as you're doing it. Here's another picture visiting a small flock at a subdivision, sitting right there on the fence in this middle of the subdivision. So even if you live in the middle of town, you're not going to get away from these guys because they are everywhere. Temperature, again, when you're looking at housing, one of the things you want to take into account is temperature. Now, this is the different times. You'll notice we did a spring, summer, and fall on these. And the summer was an early summer. It was not a late summer. But when you look at the temperature spread, you know, you're looking at 41 to 101 degrees. In the spring, it started off 26 to 85. In the fall, we did get down to 31, but we had 99. So again, you've got to have a housing that's going to allow those birds to stay cool, but at the same time, it's going to let those birds keep warm. Think about that as you're doing this. The other thing you got to think about is, do they have water? Now, I showed you those pens we had where they were movable water, so we had to haul water out there all the time. That was a pain in the butt, but I had undergrad students to take care of that. But it's hard to see in this picture, but this is all iced over. So this is a solid ice cube because at night it froze. So now you've got to dump all that out, re-put it in, and fill it up fresh. So again, think about that. This time of year, you're going to have frozen waters. Make sure the water's clean. Give them a couple times a day. Particularly in the summer, you're going to want to make sure they're never low on water, and keeping it fresh will really, really help. So again, make sure you watch your birds and think about these things as you design it. The last thing I want to talk about real quick is the environment. You know, we said earlier that one of the things that the birds do is they're allowed to freely roam, and people talk about how it's better for the environment. But if you think about it, if I raise 100 birds inside a chicken house, they poop the same as I put 100 birds outside. So as far as the amount of manure the birds generate, there's really not any difference. The only concern that really is that because you're not containing that manure in, say, a structure that you can then utilize on your garden or wherever you want, it's out in the environment, there is the potential for it to be washed into waterways and create or add to environmental problems. And yes, that is a picture of the bay just south of here. So the marshlands, really pretty area. However, because if we have a lot of land and we don't have a lot of birds and they're moving around over that pasture, it's probably not going to cause a problem, especially if we take and harvest the grass. So if we're cutting that grass and using it for something else, say pasture and cows, or we're cutting the grass and composting it, we're going to be removing those nutrients, and it's really not going to cause any kind of a problem. And with that, I think that's all I really had today.